Wendy Harris was on her way home, barely able to stand straight from fatigue. She'd been dealing with so much lately. Work, home, sick husband, as well as her son who had always wanted maternal affection and attention. Although her 13-year-old son Bobby never caused her any trouble. Even more so, he helped around the house and was a great student, always trying to make his mother happy. A mere thought of her son brought a sweet smile to Wendy's lips. Bobby was the one good thing in her life. And there was her job too. Wendy worked at a tailor studio where she managed to simultaneously combine the duties of a seamstress and a fashion designer. You have golden hands and an excellent imagination. I could only dream of such talent, said the owner of the studio, David Hall. They were about the same age, but they treated each other in a markedly polite manner, never crossing the line of propriety. Wendy felt that David liked her, but she was married, which meant that she immediately rejected any thoughts of a possible relationship. Moreover, she couldn't leave her husband, who was in dire need of her help. He'd been dealing with the consequences of a serious illness for the past 10 years. But things used to be very different before his illness. David worked in a construction company and managed to travel all over the country, working on construction contracts. One day, he could be laying the foundation of a house in Oklahoma, and the next day, he'd be repairing the facade of an elementary school in Maine. Friends often used to tell Wendy that Ethan could easily be having an affair with all that traveling. But she never believed them. No, my husband isn't like that. As for his work, isn't it a good thing that his services are in such great demand? Everything really was as Wendy said. Unfortunately, trouble came knocking on the door of the Harris family home. Ethan got sick at work and fainted. Fortunately, his colleagues had called an ambulance right away, and the doctors managed to save the young builder. As it turned out, Ethan had a rather rare heart condition, which hadn't been diagnosed early for some unknown reason. And that was despite the fact that Ethan's mother was a doctor, albeit a slightly different specification. It's all because of his job, all that travel, frequent climate change. And he did it all to provide for you and your child. Priscilla Moore was indignant. Wendy looked at her mother-in-law with tears in her eyes and couldn't believe that it was all really happening. Ethan chose his job himself. He was already a construction worker when he met his future wife. So what was Wendy's fault then? Was she supposed to make him stop doing what he loved? After Ethan underwent surgery, the doctors strongly recommended that he refrain from physical labor. But that's the only thing I can do. How am I supposed to live now? How will I provide for my family? The young builder asked with sadness in his voice. Wendy did her best to support her husband through those difficult times, but it turned out to be rather difficult. Ethan withdrew into himself and literally plunged headlong into his illness. Wendy had to do everything herself. Juggling work and managing the household, she virtually forgot what it was like to have a day off. Ethan didn't help much. He mostly just lay in bed, contemplating how much time fate had allotted to him. Darling, you can't do that. You'll wither away. No one has the ability to know their future. But it's important not to waste the precious time we do have. It seems rather foolish. Wendy tried to reason with her husband, but it was all in vain. Ethan stubbornly refused to accept reality as it was and continued to dwell on the past. And while he had the opportunity to do so, Wendy simply couldn't afford such a luxury. Their young son Bobby needed care and attention. Meanwhile, she had to work really hard to make sure the studio could stay afloat and have a steady stream of customers. David understood how difficult Wendy's situation was, so he tried to give her bonuses whenever he could. Being an intelligent and far-sighted entrepreneur, he understood that he couldn't afford to lose such a valuable employee, which meant that he needed to help Wendy however he could. During the time Wendy worked for David, the number of orders the studio got almost tripled. They had won several awards at the state and national level. And the other day, the owner of the studio received an invitation to take part in a fashion exhibition in New York. Can you even imagine it, Wendy? We'd get so many new opportunities. Our studio will finally get famous, David exclaimed with undisguised pride in his voice. Of course, Wendy was happy to hear about the studio's success. But on the other hand, the woman understood perfectly well that she was just an ordinary seamstress who designed clothes in her free time. Time seemed to fly by. Ethan was still lost in his sad thoughts, and Bobby had grown up and celebrated his 13th birthday recently. 10 years had passed since Ethan's accident. But nearly nothing had changed in Wendy's life in all that time. Although there was one piece of good news after all. Since Ethan suffered his heart attack at work, the management of the construction company paid him substantial compensation, which ended up in his mother's pocket. Priscilla Moore used part of this money to buy a car for her personal use. Ethan bought himself a new laptop, which he used to master programming and video editing. Wendy also got something. It was a food processor that was supposed to help her cook healthy food for Ethan. It was purchased for this purpose only, since Priscilla believed that her daughter-in-law didn't deserve anything for herself. But Wendy dreamed of having her own car. Even some tiny used car would make her happy. It would be of great help to her at work, especially considering that they were about to sign a couple of contracts with firms in New York. But Priscilla Moore had her own take on the situation. She only cared about her son and no one else. Wendy didn't try to argue with her. She understood Priscilla, since Wendy also was a mother, raising her son virtually on her own. Once in a while, Ethan would help a little around the house, but those occasions were so rare that it had virtually no effect on the overall situation. Wendy had already come to terms with this, realizing that her husband was having it hard. At the same time, she desperately downplayed her own merits, as if feeling embarrassed that the illness affected Ethan and not herself. Her friends constantly insisted that Wendy didn't take care of herself and was working herself to the bone for the sake of her family's well-being. Well, what other choice do I have? I'm married to Ethan. How could I let him down at such a crucial moment? And then there's Bobby too. 13 years old, such a challenging age. If I miss out on his upbringing now, it can be too late later, Wendy replied. Her friends just shook their heads. David also repeatedly hinted to Wendy that she was working too much, but he couldn't convince her to take more time off. Wendy tried to only look forward, spending 12 hours a day at the studio. The young seamstress was so eager to win awards at the exhibition in New York that she couldn't think of anything else. That day too, as Wendy was on her way home from work, she felt that she used her time very productively. Her beloved husband was waiting for her at home, as well as her son, who seemed to have matured a lot lately. Having approached the door, Wendy noted that Bobby's bike wasn't in its usual place. He must be out riding with friends. I should call him in about half an hour to remind him not to stay out too long, the mother thought lovingly. The door was unlocked, which surprised Wendy. Ethan usually preferred to keep it locked at all times, fearing intruders, especially since his disability would make it impossible for him to try to fight them. Wendy stepped inside and almost immediately heard voices coming from the kitchen. She listened more attentively and realized that the voices belonged to her husband and mother-in-law. Wendy had already taken a breath to greet them when she heard something strange. "Mom, when will I be able to openly date Amanda? I love her," Ethan said. Wendy turned pale and her lips started trembling treacherously. What did Ethan mean, and who was this Amanda? Meanwhile, Priscilla continued. "Son, I didn't fight for your disability for you to reveal our plan before it's time. You know that the reevaluation committee will refute the fact of your disability, and you'll lose your disability checks." "Well, what's the point of those checks, Mom? They're the reason I've been living locked up for 10 years. Every day I live in fear that Wendy will come home early before I get back from Amanda's," Ethan protested. An awkward pause hung in the room for a moment, then Priscilla replied, "Well, I don't know, son. It's up to you, of course. But keep in mind that you'll lose half of everything you own in the divorce. And what about the house? It's Wendy's, isn't it? You'll have to consider everything. If I were you, I wouldn't rush things, and I would live off your wife for a while longer. Can't you just wait?" Ethan argued back, but Wendy didn't hear her response. The unexpected truth stunned her and made her see the situation in a completely different light. "So that's what you've been planning? You want to get my house? You're talking about divorce. Well, you won't get me that easily," Wendy thought. Having suppressed the urge to have it out with the conspirators right then and there, Wendy tactfully coughed and slammed the front door loudly. Wendy felt uncomfortable pretending that everything was fine, so she said that she had a headache and went into her room. The initial shock had worn off, giving way to a cold calculation. That same evening, Wendy gave David a call and asked him to help her find a good family lawyer. While Ethan and his mother were pondering how much longer they could hide the truth, Wendy was preparing to strike first. Having filed for divorce, she shocked her husband with the news, which had Ethan immediately trying to simulate a heart attack. "Just stop it, Ethan. I know everything about your plan with your mommy and your lover, Amanda. I won't interfere with you seeing Bobby, provided that he wants to see you. As for us, goodbye, Ethan. We're on different paths from now on," Wendy said at parting. Ahead of her was a long exhibition tour across the cities of various states with David and Bobby, during which she could, almost for the first time in her life, spend time the way she really wanted. Later on, Ethan made several attempts to get back his wife, but all of them proved futile. Wendy couldn't forgive the decade-long betrayal, and therefore she made the only right decision to finally start living for herself, her son, and her new husband, David, with whom new creative heights awaited her.